Welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. It's Friday afternoon, the 28th of March, 2014. Webster Tarpley speaking to you from Washington, D.C. For those who were waiting for a concrete threat to the Russian populations of eastern Ukraine, to Obama, who denied in his Brussels speech of the other day that there was any concrete threat to the Russian population of eastern Ukraine. Put this in your pipe and smoke it. The kleptocratic gas princess, Yulia Timoshenko, certainly the richest and most corrupt person in Ukraine. This Timoshenko has been wiretapped on her phone, where she recommends the use of nuclear weapons to incinerate and kill 8 million Russians in the eastern Ukraine. And she also criticizes the current fascist gang by saying that they're incompetent. They should have found a way to somehow accomplish this sooner. So you want a concrete threat. This woman is the odds-on favorite to become the president of Ukraine at the end of May. Will she then proceed to nuke the 8 million Russians? If you were a Russian, would you wait to see? Well, I don't know, and I don't want to find out. And no more U.S. support for this kleptocratic gas princess, right? She's not even a real blonde, as we found when she got out of prison, where she had wisely been put. It was one of the few good things that old Yanukovych actually managed to do. So in response to that kind of a threat, Putin and the Russian Federation have massed some troops along the Ukrainian border. This is now the land border. This is facing places like Kharkov and Donetsk and Lugansk and places like this. And this is so impressive. It has seized control of the superheated imaginations of the Western pundit class. And there are now estimates that the Russians have 40,000 men. They have 80,000 men, according to one estimate on NPR this morning. And, of course, the message to the fascist clique in Kiev ought to be clear. Watch out. We're here, and if you start these threatened massacres against Russian civilians in eastern Ukraine, you will be rolled over. And I cannot imagine how anyone could object to this. Of course, neocons and Wall Street Democrats will find a way. Now, this is, I think, a successful so far attempt. These Russian spearheads opposite those principal cities, Kharkov, Donetsk, above all, managed to destabilize and intimidate the fascists without military action. And what we're seeing is, at least to a certain degree, the ongoing collapse and dissolution of the Ukrainian state apparatus. Their navy has collapsed completely. Their army, to the extent that it was in the Crimea, has collapsed. Large parts of this have gone over to the Russian side. The Russian navy is now bigger. And one thing you should bear in mind, right? Not only was the Crimea attacked by the British and the French from 1853 to 1856 in the famous Crimean War, right? The charge of the Light Brigade was the British trying to break up a Russian fortress, and it failed. But after World War I, the French, Messieurs les Français, had sent their forces to Sevastopol and to Odessa, where they occupied those ports as part of an attempted envelopment of Russia, right, during the Russian Civil War of 1919 to 1920, which failed, but could have gone much further. And the fascist gangs are on the march. The fascist gangs of Kiev are now parading themselves outside the so-called Supreme Rada. What is the Ukrainian Rada, we might well ask. There are some essays from the Bolshevik period that give certain answers to this, but today we ask, what is the Rada? Let's see what they're capable of. The Night of the Long Knives has perhaps begun already in Kiev as of this past week. You'll remember that when Hitler seized power, in order to do that, Hitler needed the brown shirts, the SA, the Sturmabteilung, and the stormtroopers, as they were also called in German, of course, or in English at the time. So the brown-shirted stormtroopers were essential for street fighting against communists, trade unionists, any other political party, and so forth. But then, once Hitler had seized power in January 1933, Ernst Röhm, the morphine addict who was the head of the SA, began talking about a second revolution. And what the second revolution meant was that the brown shirts decided that they should take over the role of generals in the German army, that they should take over as the bosses of Krupp and Thyssen and Deutsche Bank and Abs and the rest of it. And, of course, this was an insoluble political problem for Hitler. It could be no second revolution. He wanted the German army under competent officers, not morphine addicts. So he therefore engineered in June, July of 1934, right, about a year and a half, in this case, after seizing power, the massacre, the execution of Röhm, and the machine gunning of dozens, scores, hundreds of leaders of the SA, and also a few other people like von Schleicher and some others who were murdered to remove possible opposition to the dictatorship. Von Pappen's personal secretary also murdered. So in that case, from Hitler's seizure of power to the first massacres of these turbulent plebeians eager to take over the seats of power, it took maybe, well, somewhat, yes, less than a year and a half. In this case, it took about a month. And I'm referring to the death of Muzychko. Muzychko, the thug, the monster, the goon, somebody who had fought alongside the Chechen terrorists against Russia in the mid-1990s, someone who's all over the internet beating up a local prosecutor, someone who essentially the wormy underside of organized crime, fascist ideology, an anti-Semite, someone who hates Russians, hates Poles, hates Germans, I'm sure hates everybody, no doubt about it. He has now become the Horst Wessel of the Maidan. Horst Wessel, of course, being the great Nazi martyr who was the subject then of the Horst Wessel song, right? It's written Horst Wessel, W-E-S-S-E-L. But Muzychko is now in that role. I believe that he's dead. He perhaps not. I don't see what special talents he would have that a trained commando couldn't do better. But the problem is, of course, is that Muzychko was a top regional leader of the right sector, Pravi Sektor, and that leaves the presidential candidate Yarosh, the head of Pravi of the right sector, and the other leader, Tarashenko, as left to somehow avenge the murder of Muzychko. And what will they do? And their bluff has been called. So we have Turchinov, the president of Ukraine, right, installed by the Putsch, who says that the provocateurs of the right sector are actually paid by Moscow. That's a novel idea. More on this in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Keep up with all of this at Tarpley.net, and Webster G. Tarpley Twitter feed. And if you go to Tarpley.net, you can see the Twitter feed through a convenient window on the left side of the page. And there's a couple of updates this week. Tom Kiley's INN World Report, kind enough to invite me on, and we'll have some more stuff, interview, discussion, roundtable with a couple of German activists and experts also will go up in the course of the next week. But now, in the meantime, the fascists are marching in Kiev. The Night of the Long Knives has robbed them of their thuggish leader, Muzychko, and the demand now is coming from Yarosh and Timoshenko that the interior minister has to quit. Now, you remember, who is the interior minister? He is Avakov. He's from the Fatherland Party, I think. But in any case, he's the jailbird. Remember, Avakov is the guy who was arrested in Rome and thrown in the clink by the Italian police because of financial crimes. But now he's come back to become the interior minister, which means the attorney general, right? The justice and police minister or the police minister. So they want Avakov to be fired. They want him out because they accuse Avakov of being part of a conspiracy to kill their fascist confrere, Muzychko. Well, originally the government, led by Yatsenyuk, did not want to have a debate about the future of Avakov, but now they've been forced to do it. And what forced them to do it? Several thousand fascist thugs, Nazi thugs, armed with hatchets, knives, clubs, and God knows what else, concealed weapons, blocked the front of the Supreme Rada in Kiev on the 27th, Thursday, and the 28th, Friday, today, and they're demanding the ouster of Avakov. Yarosh, of course, is a gangster, and Timoshenko is the one who wants the nuclear forces back for Ukraine. Yarosh, of course, has threatened to blow up the Trans-Siberian pipeline to cut off the income going to the hated government in Moscow. So what is that? Would that be something that would justify an armed intervention by Russia? If not the nuking of the 8 million Russians, maybe the money question speaks louder to the predatory Western financiers. Blow up the Trans-Siberian pipeline. That, of course, would lead to many deaths in Ukraine by freezing, and winter still has a ways to go over there, right? I once was in Moscow myself on May 1st, and it was snowing. I was once in the eastern part of West Germany, near the DDR line, and it was snowing on May 1st also that time. So this is a continental climate, cold area. Winter goes on for a while. But you can now see, you go to RT or go to others, the parade of these fascists, and what a bunch of thugs and goons. Now, somehow, when Obama made his appearance in Brussels, he forgot all about this. He tried to deny it. He tried to somehow get these facts out of the world, I guess we can say. And he mentioned fascism, I believe, once, which was but only in a kind of a hyperbole, saying, oh, the Russians are accusing us of conspiring with fascists against them. And then he gets into this number saying, my grandfather was part of George Patton's Third Army who defeated the Nazis. Well, what have you done for me lately, Obama? In Obama's summary of European history in this Brussels speech, which I urge people to take a look at, it's a document of hysteria. Hysteria in the clinical sense of denying the obvious facts. Obama managed to get through the history of Europe in the 20th century without mentioning fascism or Nazism, but only extreme nationalism. I'm sorry, Obama, the issue is fascism, and you can't liquidate that issue just with this offhand rhetorical flourish. Obama does have the sense, and I guess this is the operative part, to say that Russia poses no threat to the United States. True. However, and Obama is speaking with his soap opera breathless voice, he gets into this blather about the young people of Maidan, the young people of Maidan. Take a look at the Rada today, Barkey, and you'll see what the young people of Maidan look like, except they're wearing ski masks and brandishing hatchets and baseball bats, clubs, knives, chains, razor blades, God knows what, that they were showing. He said he was so touched because they were showing the portraits of the poor victims of the snipers. Well, the snipers, of course, were coming from the anti-Yanukovych, the rebel side, so to speak. And, of course, you look even more closely, Barkey, you'll see that those portraits include the infamous Nazi collaborator, the Quisling of Ukraine, Stepan Bandera. And I must say, you go to Norway, you're not going to find too many monuments to Vidkun Quisling, who was executed by the Norwegians. And you go to France, you're not going to find too many monuments to the memory of Marshal Pétain, who was condemned to death by the French, but his sentence was commuted by de Gaulle for humanitarian reasons of advanced age and so forth. But if you go to Ukraine, you will find more than 24 statues of the fascist Nazi collaborator Bandera, who outdid himself. Was his pogrom against the Jews the biggest one, or was it his pogrom against the Poles? Because this was also a dispute, right? Who was going to get control of the city of Lvov? So, Obama, you're living in a fantasy world here. I guess the State Department must have written the text. Maybe we have to give Barkey that one. So he says the key parts, I think, are borders, ethnic minorities. These are tensions that have led to debate and democratic referendums. They have to be addressed through constitutional means and international law so that majorities cannot simply suppress minorities. Hey, how about in Ukraine that a minority, the Maidan fascist gangs, 20, 30,000 people out of 50 million, they're oppressing everybody, and they are now, they say they have veto power over any appointments, any policies, and what have you, and they're trying to show that through this Avakov. And then he cites the Kosovo example. This is priceless. We're going to have to get to this in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. Obama seems to have lost any self-irony. Again, I imagine this was written by the State Department, but nevertheless, he said it came out of his mouth. Then he says the Russian leaders have claimed Kosovo as a precedent. Yes, exactly. It is a precise precedent. But he says NATO only intervened after the people of Kosovo were systematically brutalized and killed for years. The estimates of that were radically overblown by charming Madame Amanpour, who then went on to marry the State Department spokesman. Kosovo left Serbia after a referendum that was organized not outside the boundaries of international law, but in careful cooperation with the UN and Kosovo's neighbors. Wait a minute. It did not go through the Security Council, and that's what counts. And, of course, what are you arguing, Obama, that you have to wait until tens of thousands of people are dead before you do something? Or if you're dealing with declared fascists, obvious, out-and-out Nazi fascists, then don't you want to be preemptive? What's the lesson of Munich, Obama? Do you go through the appeasement of fascism, or do you act to nip it in the bud? Principiis obsta. Nip it in the bud, obviously, right? Strangle fascism in the cradle. Then we have the most priceless and most embarrassing part. Moreover, Russia has pointed to America's decision to go into Iraq as an example of Western hypocrisy. Well, he says, I was against it, and there was a debate. But even in Iraq, and now he gets very soap opera breathless, America sought to work within the international system. We did not claim or annex territory. No, you just killed 1.5 million people on top of the million or so you killed with sanctions in the previous decade. We left Iraq and its people in a fully sovereign Iraqi state, totally wrecked economically and on the verge of civil war. We're only human, says Obama. So this, obviously, not so good. Now, if we look at the results here in the UN General Assembly, what is left of the big parade of isolation of Russia, right? Oh, Russia is so isolated by the international community. Well, I would have to say, if I were Samantha Power, I would resign if this is the best you can do. This is embarrassing. This is rather weaker, as I recall, than the results on a similar resolution condemning Assad. I would go back and look at that, and I haven't had a chance to. But here's what you get. First of all, the ones who voted in favor of the Russian position on Crimea, Ukraine, 11 countries: Russia, Armenia, Belarus, Bolivia, Cuba, North Korea, Nicaragua, Sudan, just the biggest country in Africa, Syria, the leading Arab state right now, Venezuela, the leading Latin American state, and Zimbabwe, which has broken a lance against the imperialists. So 11 vote with Russia. This is not isolation. Isolation is what happens when it's everybody in the world against the U.S. and the Israelis. That's what isolation is, Sam. You've been on the short end of that stick. 58 countries abstained. 58 countries. And then 100 voted for the anti-Russian resolution. But you notice that also leaves the no-shows, the AWOLs. And that's, I think, 24 or 25 countries. So again, it's 100 for the U.S., 11 for Russia, but 58 abstentions and 24 AWOLs. So if you add up the ones who refuse to support it, you get a total of, 69, 89, you get 93. So the score is actually 100 for the U.S. side to 93. And I absolutely count the AWOLs as people who, if they could vote for the U.S., would clearly vote for the U.S. and try to get some benefits, right? Try to extort some exchange for that. But they don't want to vote for the U.S. They feel they can't vote for the U.S., but they're afraid of the U.S., right? They're afraid of the global reach of the CIA and what have you. So that is not exactly a great diplomatic success. Not too doggone good for Sam Power, and I have to take a minute to comment on the ravaged appearance of Madame Power. She's looking awful. She's sporting the ravaged look, I'm afraid. Perhaps too much recreational substances with hubby Cass. I don't know, but she is not suitable in any case, no matter what she looks like, for the representative of the United States. Right? Russia isolated. No, sorry, Sam. Russia not isolated. And, of course, Obama's mention of Russia as a regional power, this is ridiculous. Alone, the Russian nuclear arsenal promotes it to the very first rank of world powers, because those topoles can go all around the world, and there are some nuclear submarines left. And God knows, even those old Bear bombers and backfire bombers can do something. So this was not a great victory. So the other side of it is, of course, in terms of sanctions, right? Obama, I think, largely going through the motions, not really willing to do anything much about this, but he was looking for the Europeans to damage their own economic situation by engaging in sanctions. And in Germany, you look at my Twitter feed, you followed it, the deputy head of the Christian Social Union, CSU, of Bavaria, at one of their recent conferences, Ash Wednesday, earlier this month, said that they wanted negotiations with Russia and no confrontation. And then we had Ursula von der Leyen, an unfortunate lady, she's the German defense minister, shooting her mouth off about possible military developments, ridiculous. And the SPD vice chancellor came forward to say, shut your mouth. And she was told to can it. Merkel came out and said, we are at no more sanctions. We don't want any more sanctions, because she'd be cutting her own throat politically. This could bring about her fall, because if she doesn't keep those German exporters and banks happy, then what good is she? So, National Public Radio thinks that the world is united except for China. No, I'm sorry. This is much more widespread. So the other problem that Obama has is he's talked about, well, we could give you assurances, right? We give you assurances that your interests will not be trampled. But, of course, it's too late for that now. Where Russia was given assurances that NATO would not go into East Germany. Now, apparently, the German government still honors that. They will not allow U.S. or NATO forces to go into the former DDR territory, but the assurance was that NATO would not be pushed up to the very borders of the former Soviet Union, or in this case, the Russian Federation. But instead, that has been done. Then we had the Libyan resolution, and then we had the famous 21st of February, when Sikorsky, Fabius, and Steinmeier made a deal with Yanukovych, which was worth absolutely nothing. So it's too late for promises, Barkey. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio, Tarpley.net, Webster G. Tarpley Twitter feed. So you can't give assurances. You can't say, well, we promise we won't take Sevastopol and shut down your main naval base. That's all gone, because Sikorsky, Mr. Ann Applebaum, Fabius, Le Hockey, the nasty little attack dog, and the unfortunate Steinmeier, in the tradition of, Noske, the bloodhound of the SPD, they made a deal with Yanukovych that if he did all those things, then they would guarantee the disarming of the Maidan gangs and mob, and instead they marched against the undefended presidential palace, and Yanukovych had to flee the country. So that won't work. Nothing you can say will be believed. Only possession is allowed. So what it shows is, if you don't keep your commitments, you're essentially destroying the possibility for diplomatic solutions. And you make this military solution, if that's what it is, by the Russians, inevitable. The other thing that Obama said today in his CBS interview is that Putin has a sense of grievance. I would not see it this way. Putin has a sense of being threatened. The loss of the Crimea and the ousting of the Russian Navy from Sevastopol is a threat. It's a real threat, and it's strategic encirclement. And it essentially leads towards the Brzezinski plan, the breakup of the Russian Federation into dozens of microstates, mini-states, and so forth. This is a good reason, by the way, to back off on the propaganda glorifying secessionism, right? Ron Paul is a secessionist, right? He's a neo-Confederate, and those people have no place in American history, and that goes for his little son Rand. But the idea that somehow it's time to get opportunistically on board with the Scotland referendum, the Scotland referendum that will leave them under the Queen, the Bank of England, the IMF, and NATO, that's independence. Or the Venetian referendum, which does the same thing. You leave Italy, but you're still part of the European Central Bank, the European Union, NATO, and God knows what else. One of the commentators on RT had the sense to back away from the opportunism on that secessionist point. But that's the real threat that Putin sees. So this is where we are now. No more sanctions, please. And remember the solution, simply this: Ukraine needs to be neutral. Ukraine must not join the European Union, must not join NATO. These are essentially the same thing, unfortunately. And, generally speaking, assume a posture of neutrality. It includes suppressing fanatical, lunatic, anti-Russian or any kind of anti-foreigner movements, such as Svoboda and the right sector. But, of course, that's the government. Fatherland, Svoboda, and right sector are the Ukrainian regime. And Yarosh is in the government, effectively, the colleague of the late Muzychko. So you got to be neutral. The second thing is a confederal internal arrangement with virtually total autonomy in terms of internal administration for East Ukraine and West Ukraine. That's if they can restrain themselves now enough to hold on to East Ukraine. Now that Timoshenko says she wants to nuke them, what would you do if you were sitting in Kharkov and the gas princess gets elected president in May? Are you going to wait for her to nuke you, or are you going to do something else? See, the whole State Department position depends on ignoring greater and greater pieces of reality. Right? Whether an individual thinker becomes great or not depends on how much a nation or a class can bear of reality. And the ability of the State Department to recognize reality is shrinking to microscopic proportions. So all of those things are now given. But let's take a look for a second at this problem of Ukraine as such. What are we dealing with here? What can we make of this country? I mean, as I've said, I think, in the previous broadcast, you have people in Ukraine who are telling international reporters that they feel betrayed by the United States, betrayed by the European Union, betrayed by Germany. And you look at them and say, well, are you fighting? Are you willing to fight for this country you say you have? Do you fight for the borders? Do you fight for the army bases, the navy bases, the headquarters, the logistics and equipment and so forth? No, they don't fight. They refuse to fight. I think they're well advised. I think it's quite wise. But once you refuse to fight, then you have no claim on anybody else's help. So I am therefore advancing metaphysical doubts concerning the existence of modern Ukraine. And my argument is that this is a country, if it's a country at all, it is a very strange entity, generally relying on the intervention of foreigners at every stage of its history. That is to say, the Kiev Rus, the Grand Duke Vladimir, 988 and all that was a serious operation. Notice, however, it did not call itself Ukraine. It did Ukraine, of course, meaning to the border, at the border. The Kiev Rus did not regard itself as the border of anything. It regarded itself as the center of that part of the world, with some good reason. But the foundation, the reason it was there was because of these Vikings, right? The so-called Varangians. And if you look at this interesting maps you can find on the internet, there was an inland waterway that led from the Black Sea up the Dnieper, where Kiev is located on the river Dnieper, and then up into European Russia, I guess we'd say today, and then with a short portage, you could get onto a river that led into the Baltic Sea, and that would get you then to the homelands of the Vikings. And of course, it's important for all kinds of history of England, to know that there's this cooperation between the Byzantine Empire at the southern end of this line and the Vikings in the north, right? The Vikings essentially go to work as an auxiliary of the Byzantine Empire in what we would call the Dark Ages in the West, in the 800s and 900s, and so forth. Then later on, and this I think is the interesting assertion, modern Ukraine, the thing that calls itself Ukraine, is in effect a creation of the German General Staff, yes, of Hindenburg and von Ludendorff during World War I. That is the first appearance of Ukraine ever on a map. The first time you look at a map and you see something that says Ukraine is the New York Times, I guess for American readers, the New York Times of February 1918, which shows the dissolution of Russia and the pieces, the fragmentation of Russia. Here are the pieces, and the biggest piece, Ukraine. But it's done by the German General Staff. And then, of course, the Ukraine of the past 23 or so years, very much under U.S. auspices, as the foul-mouthed Nuland observes, $5 billion invested in these fascists, right? When you see Muzychko, Yarosh, and so forth, right, living high on the hog, you can say, "Oh, thank God, my tax dollars at work." Right? This is absolutely monstrous. And Obama, your grandfather fighting for Patton, if he ever did, that's not going to save you from this. Let's just take a look. And we will look at the creation of Ukraine by the German General Staff when we come back in just a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley in Washington, D.C. So we're examining the very tenuous basis of Ukrainian statehood. Is there really a country there? Has there been so far? Some have argued, my friend Maurizio Blondet among others, that Ukraine as presently constituted is inherently ungovernable. And certainly as presently constituted, he may be right. I would not say that this is a hopeless case, but with neutrality and a confederal system along the Swiss model, which has worked pretty well, that would, I think that could be viable. But, well, that has to happen, and it hasn't happened yet. So the future of Ukraine, I guess, depends on that happening. But let's look about how this actually came about. As we've pointed out, Ukraine essentially was submerged, right? If we call the Kiev Rus Ukraine, the predecessor state, we'd have to say, well, this had been wiped off the map by the Mongols, right? Genghis Khan blew through in the 1200s, and the various Mongol Golden Horde and so forth, the Khanates, took over the Pontic steppe, that is to say, the flat lands north of the Black Sea. That's what you call Ukraine today. And when it came out from under the Mongol yoke, this, of course, was helped along by the Duke of Moscow, Dmitry of the Don, at the Battle of Kulikovo Field in the 1300s. That is what began to shake the power of the Mongols. And then, of course, the place came largely under the control of Poland, the very large Polish Republic, an oligarchy, of course, an oligarchical republic, and then to some extent under the Russian Empire, and some of it ended up under the Ottoman Turkish Empire, maybe a more direct successor state of the Mongols. But now, where does this come from? It disappears. It's on no map, right? You can look at the map of Europe in the 1520s. There's no Ukraine. You can look at the map at the end of the 30 Years' War in 1648, the Peace of Westphalia. No Ukraine. There, you can look at a very interesting map. You can find it on the internet by an Englishman in the 1740s, and he shows you White Russia, Belarus. He shows you Little Russia, today's Ukraine. There's a place called Red Russia, which is south of Lemberg, Lvov, right? The hometown, the Munich of the fascism and Nazism involved here. And then you look very carefully, there's the word Ukraine, just as a very small area aside the Dnieper River. So the idea is this is the borderland between what? I guess between the Russian Empire and the Polish Republic. But there's no Ukraine. So where does this come from? In World War I, there was, of course, the sponsorship of the existence of Poland, right? The reconstitution of Poland, which had been divided up in the 1770s, 1780s, 1790s. That was the reconstitution of Poland was accomplished at the Versailles Treaty. But this was one of the things that Woodrow Wilson demanded. Ukraine was not created under the aegis of the Allies, but rather under the sponsorship of the German General Staff, the Imperial German General Staff, and that means the people that we know as Hindenburg and Ludendorff. Ludendorff later, of course, becoming one of the main sponsors of Hitler, and indeed Hindenburg did the same thing finally. So, how did this happen? Well, according to a German historian from the University of Hamburg, at the beginning of World War I, various people showed up in Berlin at the Auswärtiges Amt, the Foreign Office, and announced that they represented Ukraine and that Germany should support Ukraine. Now, what was Ukraine? It was an idea that existed in the minds of a small group of intellectuals. We'd had the poet Taras Shevchenko, famous Ukrainian poet, and we'd had a couple of sort of nationalist historians, right? The nationalist historians who, in many, there's a similar case in Czechoslovakia and so on and so forth, who essentially try to make the case that a country existed. Now, the Germans, according to this interesting historian, the Germans, strictly speaking, didn't know much about Ukraine. Of course, their allies, the Austro-Hungarians, Vienna, they knew a lot about Ukraine because they had a piece of it, right? They had this area known as Eastern Galicia, right? Western Ukraine. That was under the Austrian Empire, and that included Lvov. In other words, when the Polish state had been dismembered, Russia took a piece, Prussia, Germany took a piece, and Austria-Hungary also took a piece. But this is then not anymore the case. So these people coming to Germany said, look, you should support us. We have a national movement going, and we can actually help you. So the Germans, according to this account, they order up all kinds of studies to see what are we dealing with. Get some ethnographers in here. Get some demographers in here. Let's try to figure out what's happening. And they decide, well, it does look like there is something that we can call Ukraine, and they need something like Ukraine. The point being that the obvious choice, if you want to destabilize the Russian Empire in Europe, the obvious thing is to use the Poles, right? But the problem was the Poles already had a big resentment against the Germans, against Prussia, because they had been under the Prussian yoke themselves for quite a while, and they found that this was not good, right? This was unsatisfactory. So, in order to find somebody that they could work with, the Prussians, the Germans, had to turn to these Ukrainians. So what did they do? They had a group of about 50,000 Ukrainian, Russians, right? Russians from the Russian army that they had captured, right, at the Battle of Tannenberg and other places in the first year of the war, right? They had big victories over the Russian army, so they captured about 50,000 people that could be identified or could be located as coming from these areas that were part of this theoretical construct called Ukraine. Okay, so they went to these people. The Germans sent in their agents, and they said, look, we'll take you out of the normal prisoner of war camp, and we'll put you in special prisoner of war camps. And those will be in Germany. Those will be much better than what you're going to get anywhere else, and you won't have to work. What are you going to do? You're not going to go to work. What's going to happen to you is that you're going to be given classes. So what are the classes? What kind of classes are they going to take? The classes are, first of all, Ukrainian history. Well, they're not interested in Ukrainian history. They don't see any point to it. They've never heard of Ukraine. Nobody's ever told them they were Ukrainian. So then the Germans say, well, look, in that case, what we'll have to do is we'll change it. We'll give you practical instruction in agriculture and in socialist revolution, communist revolution. So they got about 10,000 cadre trained out of these camps, and we'll be back in a minute. And welcome back to World Crisis Radio. So we're just telling the story of modern Ukraine. Modern Ukraine was founded in German prisoner of war camps, that is, camps run by the Imperial German Army, by Hindenburg and Ludendorff, in 1914, 15, 16, where the Germans had decided to manufacture Ukrainians. They would essentially synthesizing a Ukrainian nationality based on some poetry, some historical works, but above all, the peasants who were captured by the Germans, who got special treatment in these camps, didn't have to work, had to go to class. They were not interested in the history of Ukraine. Rather, what they were interested in was agronomy, various kinds of farming techniques, and so forth. And the reason they were interested in this was because the word was out that there was going to be a revolution in the East, and there was going to be a land reform, and it was going to be possible to break up the great landed estates, the latifundia, and each one of them was going to get a piece of the action. So they wanted to know how to do it. They wanted to become kulaks, in effect. And they were also taught the need for socialism, but a certain amount of anti-Russian stuff was also put in, right? The reason you guys are badly off is because the Russian Tsar steals all the wealth. So back they go, and when the Russian Revolution breaks out, now remember, this, what I've just described, is coherent with the idea that Hindenburg and Ludendorff sent Lenin across Germany in the sealed train from Switzerland to the Finland station, right, in St. Petersburg, Leningrad, to start a revolution. Why? They didn't think he was going to seize power. They thought that he was going to create chaos and interfere with the Russian Empire war effort. They wanted the Russian Empire out of the war, and they wanted to expand, and they wanted some other stuff, as we're going to see just a second. Once you get the abdication of the Tsar, right, February, March 1917, the creation of the Kerensky government, there is this thing called the Ukrainian Rada, which is created. Now, it's businessmen, property owners, lawyers, professors, petty bourgeois, whatever. So there's a power center in Kiev right away, but at the same time, the Bolsheviks, the communists, set up their own competing People's Republic of the Ukraine, December 1917, in Kharkov. And since the Kharkov People's Republic of the Ukraine has the help of the Red Army, they begin to expand rapidly, and it's just a question of time before this Ukrainian Rada is going to be swept away. But at this point, intervene Hindenburg and Ludendorff again, the German General Staff, and the point is this. The Anglo-American sea blockade is starving Germany. They can't get any food. So the German military says to the Ukrainian Rada, look, you declare yourself independent of Russia. we want to make a treaty with you. The only way we can make a treaty is if you're a sovereign state, become a sovereign state. They do it. And now let's make peace. And this is the so-called bread peace. The bread peace of February 9th, 1918, where the Ukrainian state comes into existence because of actions by the German General Staff. And here's the point. The Germans say, look, we'll make peace with you. We'll even reward you in various ways. We'll give you little pieces of Ukraine that are parts of other countries. We'll make sure that the Ukrainians that you say are Ukrainians that are in the Austrian Empire, we'll make sure that they get special good treatment. So let's sign the peace. And it's the bread peace. Brotfrieden. And why the bread peace? Well, Germany is going to protect the Rada and recognize them, but here's what they want in return. The Germans want 100 million tons of grain. 100 million tons of grain. 400 million eggs. 400 million eggs. A lot of omelets. 50,000 tons of beef. They want bacon, sugar, hemp, linseeds, manganese ore, and other staples. So that's the deal. You give us food, we give you military support. That's the birth of the modern Ukraine. And the guy that I'm quoting here is a professor, Frank Golchevsky of the University of Hamburg, interviewed in Der Spiegel back in 2007, a time where the current events would not be predictable. So this is not something that somebody's writing because of the needs of the moment. So as a result of this, the Austrian foreign minister, Count Czernin, says, okay, this is a bread peace. And you see then, February 17th, 1918, New York Times, dismembered Russia, some of the fragments. So the Austrians send in 250,000 soldiers to get a piece of Ukraine, and the Bolsheviks then sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk about a month later, March 3rd, 1918. The Bolsheviks say, okay, fine, we give up. Poland will be independent. Ukraine will be independent. Baltic states, all independent. We just want peace. Now, this question, is Ukraine a German wartime invention? Here's what Golchevsky says. He's asked by the interviewer, could Ukraine ever have emerged without German help? And Golchevsky essentially says, no, that's not really true. But this is what the enemies of Germany and the enemies of Ukraine have been asserting ever since. The Polish National Democrats, now these are right-wing nationalists. The Prime Minister Grabski, I think, is an example of this. The Polish National Democrats, between the wars, said there never were any Ukrainians, but they were a German invention. The British and the French, the Entente, were inclined to believe the same thing. The writer and journalist Joseph Roth, and this is a guy from a place called Brody, which is an area that's gone back and forth between Ukraine and Poland and Austria and all this other stuff. According to this guy, 1939, he wrote, Ukrainians were made in Germany. So the Roth, his analysis is, the Germans invented the Ukrainians in order to smash the Russian state. So Golchevsky says the Ukrainians were considered from 1919 to 1939 as a fifth column for Germany. That's what Ukraine was. And he says this is really not fair at the beginning, but as time goes on, it gets to be more and more clear. Now, Hindenburg and Ludendorff want the food. The problem is the Rada is incompetent, and within a couple of months, it's clear they're only delivering about 1/6 or 1/5 of the grain. Of course, war and chaos are going on. So the Russians say, okay, Rada, you're out, kick him out. Bring in the former Russian general Pavlo Skoropadsky as Hetman, Supreme Military Commander. of Ukraine. And we'll continue this in just a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. So, the modern Ukraine emerges from German prisoner of war camps where the Ukrainian, Russian prisoners of war are indoctrinated with the Ukrainian national identity, among other things. And then the actual recognition of the Ukrainian state comes from Hindenburg and Ludendorff for 100 million tons of grain, 400 million eggs, 50,000 tons of beef, and so forth. So the Ukrainians don't deliver. The Rada is then dispersed, right? The Germans kick them out. They bring in the Skoropadsky, and he at least brings on some law and order, but he also gets involved in a war against Poland towards the end of his tenure, and Poland is able to assert its control of Lvov, Lvov in Russian, Lwow in Polish, Lviv in Ukrainian, Lemberg in German, and in other parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, say the Italian part, Leopoli. So that's, of course, the main center, right? That's the Munich of Ukrainian fascism in our time. So here's the problem, though. When the Germans collapse in November 1918, revolution and so forth, the armistice is signed, they got to get out. Skoropadsky falls apart and is replaced by an oligarchy known as the Directorate. And in this Directorate, right, in the post-German phase now, they let the Sow out. And that's Simon Petliura, Petliura, the master of the pogrom. And the killings of the Jewish population begin in grand style. So here we see this militant anti-Semitism, murderous anti-Semitism that you find among the Ukrainian fascists of our time. So the place is a battlefield in the Russian Civil War. You have Denikin and Wrangel going in there. The French take over Odessa and Sevastopol for quite a while. By 1920, the White armies have been pretty much defeated for the moment, but then we get the war between Russia and Poland, Marshal Pilsudski against Lenin in 1920 and 1921. And essentially the Lvov area ends up as part of Poland, but the eastern part stays in Russia. And that goes until the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, when Poland once again disappears, and pretty much all of it, then all of Ukraine, goes under the USSR. Now, when Hitler attacks the Soviets in June of 1941, we get the emergence of this Stepan Bandera. Bandera, the quisling, Bandera, the Nazi collaborator. He is now the current hero of Svoboda and Right Sector. You'll find his portraits on the Maidan. He's the hero, the spiritus rector of Maidan. Large-scale massacres. He's trying, essentially, as the as the Wehrmacht arrives, he's trying to show Hitler that he's the guy who should become the Gauleiter of the Ukrainian puppet state. But the Germans are not interested. Bandera creates the Nachtigall and Roland battalions, Nightingale and Roland of the Waffen-SS. They're then put together into the Galicia division of the Waffen-SS. Among their pieces of handiwork, 35,000 Russian communists killed in, or any kind of communist killed in Galicia. But the problem is that Bandera wants some kind of an independent, or at least seemingly independent Ukrainian puppet state. Hitler won't allow that. So once the Nazis are done, Bandera goes to work then for the captive nations apparatus of the CIA under Allen Dulles, works out of Radio Free Europe in Munich, directs terrorism assassinations. The KGB takes him out in 1959. And again, 24+ cities have statues of this character. Remember, Stalin felt he had to ingratiate the Ukrainians. Soviets got 3 votes in the UN General Assembly. One went to White Russia, the other one went to Ukraine, along with the principal Soviet one, and then Khrushchev gives them the Crimea. And then when you get the August coup in 1991, the Ukrainian nomenclatura under Leonid Kravchuk, they declare independence. They then declare a referendum. Now, there had been a referendum in early 1991. 75% of the Ukrainians voted to remain within the federal system of the USSR, Union of Soviet Sovereign States it was going to be. But then the Moscow coup d'etat, Kravchuk is afraid because he supported the coup. He was against Yeltsin. Yeltsin wins. He's afraid, what is Yeltsin going to do to me? Got to get out, and therefore they declare independence. Notice it's not based on a mass movement. In no way. So, that then leads to the December 1991 referendum when 90% vote this time to leave the USSR. The attempt to synthesize a Ukrainian identity also depends on this Holodomor, the idea of a deliberately induced genocidal famine in 1932-1933 done by Stalin against Ukraine. Well, the eminent French historian Annie Lacroix, University of Paris 7, points out that if you look at the French diplomatic correspondence, they say, well, there's a food scarcity in 32-33 in Ukraine, but also Northern Caucasus and Kazakhstan. It's only the Nazi German and fascist Italian diplomats who write saying there's a deliberate famine for genocidal purposes. You can compare this to the U.S. Dust Bowl, right? Something similar going on in Oklahoma at this point. So the Germans and the Italians take it up, and then William Randolph Hearst, the pro-fascist press baron here in the U.S. So the question then is, Jewish organizations that are silent on the true nature of the Maidan, Right Sector, Svoboda, and so forth, some of them have spoken out, but what you don't have is a coordinated campaign. So if you add it up, it's a place that has been created from the outside by those Varangian Swedish Vikings, by the German General Staff, several interventions by Hitler, and then by the U.S. after the 1980s. So very weak basis of nationality. And therefore, I think the idea would be neutrality and a confederation on the Swiss model, because Switzerland had the same problem, right? 3 different languages, 4 different languages, and so forth. Now, let's take a quick look at Syria before the time gets to be too short. Some really interesting things here. We have this wiretapping of Davutoglu. This is published on the RT website today. It looks like the Russians have got some great phone tapping operations. They seem to have cracked the cell phone code, and of course we're going to forgive them all their posturing about how great Snowden is and how governments should not tap phones. You go ahead and tap these phones. What they say is a Turkish general says, we got to attack Syria. I'll make up a cause for war by ordering a missile attack on Turkey. In other words, he says, this is Hakan Fidan, I'll send 4 minutes to Syria. I'll make up a cause of war by ordering a missile attack on Turkey, and then we'll have a pretext to go to war. And you've got the foreign minister, Davutoglu, in these conversations. Resign. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. So, you've got to look at this complete transcript of the Turkish generals and foreign minister Davutoglu, who now is exposed as a complete fool. I must say, it was not obvious to me at the beginning what an idiot this guy is. And they're talking about the usual stuff, right? False flag, provocations, don't hold your breath, NBC, CBS, NBC, ABC, CNN, MSNBC, not likely to have it. So the idea is, it looks like they've also been guilty of setting off bombs in Turkey, trying to blame this on Syria, right? They shot down a Syrian plane the other day. Turkish officials conspiring to stage an attack on Syria to provoke a wider war. And this is why our dear friend, lightheaded Recep Erdogan, or Erdogan as it's written, for us in the West, he's trying to shut down Twitter and trying to shut down large parts of the internet because his infamy is now on display. And this poor guy, well, this villain, is someone who was conned into this by his nighttime friend, Obama, who would call him and whisper in his ear that he would be the new caliph and the new ruler of that tremendous region. So we've got a lot of anger among the neocons about Syria. We've got Robert Kagan, who is, of course, the hubby of foul-mouthed Victoria Nuland, the brother of Field Marshal Kagan and Kim Kagan, who were the groupies of Petraeus and presumably involved in the planning of whatever stunt Petraeus was going to pull, perhaps under the cover of Benghazi. If you want to learn about Benghazi, put these characters on the stand along with Petraeus. But Robert Kagan says Obama is guilty of giving Americans what they want. They want to stay out of Syria, stay out of Ukraine, but he says the Americans are actually ashamed of not intervening. He's giving Americans what they want, but not something they will thank him for. To follow a leader to triumph inspires loyalty, gratitude, and affection. Following a leader in retreat inspires no such emotions. What a load of garbage. And that is, one dead GI is not worth all the hot air of all these disgusting neocons. So they just have no shame, right? They never change. Krauthammer, similarly today, right? Krauthammer also freaking out. Obama's a weakling. The U.S. is in retreat. It's either going to be U.S. leadership chaos or domination by Russia and China. Can you imagine returning to a mode of world leadership which is not based on bluster, aggression, and intimidation, but on real world economic development? In other words, the spirit of the Marshall Plan. Evidently, Krauthammer can't. So we also got George Will. They're all absolutely up in arms. Concerning the Washington Post, this is embarrassing. On March 3rd, the Washington Post published an article called "Ukraine Will Fight." You read it, Ukraine will fight. And this was signed by William Taylor, Stephen Piffer, John Herbst. These are ex-U.S. ambassadors to Ukraine. And we've also got Roman Papaduic and William Green Miller also contributed to the articles. We got 5 U.S. ambassadors to Ukraine, and they've all got egg all over their faces because they said about a month ago, Ukraine will fight. Well, Ukraine didn't fight, did it, guys? You're going to publish an apology to the public. Also in the diplomatic correspondence, we have the current foreign minister of Ukraine, right, the public face of the fascist regime, Andrei Deshitsia. I'm sorry, that's his name, Andrei Deshitsia. Reject Russia's Anschluss. Oh, getting nasty, huh? The last line, the party line at the end, of course. The rest of the world will sleep better at night knowing that the new international reality doesn't depend on any whims of more Hitler impersonators. Well, my question to Minister Deshitsia, who Hitler? Who Hitler? Who you calling Hitler? You are the front man for Muzychko, the late Muzychko, Yarosh, Chanibok, Timoshenko, and the rest of these monsters, and you're talking about somebody in Moscow being the new Hitler? Boy, you are off the wall. Now, we want to congratulate General Sisi for his campaign to become president of Egypt. We would recommend that he gets an economic that he get an economic program. I don't think there are going to be all these executions. Obviously, he's paid by the Saudis. That's protection money that he's getting from the Saudis. Doesn't mean the Saudis control what he does. They're afraid of the Muslim Brotherhood. Barkey is in Saudi Arabia today, groveling. The American people are sick of these monstrous Gulf monarchies. We don't want them. However, this notion about oil, right, that the U.S. is going to be energy independent, the shale oil boom is temporary. It is a backward form of energy. It is really a blind alley. You put all your eggs into that basket, right, of shale oil, then within a couple of years it's gone. And what have you got? You're in big trouble. We need fission today, fourth-generation high-temperature pebble-bed nuclear reactors, 100 new ones immediately, and we need fusion. We need ITER, which is under the leadership of the eminent Russian physicist Velikhov, that people may remember from somebody who's been fighting for fusion energy for decades and decades. Now, we've got the Koch brothers attacking Obamacare. This is actually interesting. The deadline for Obamacare, right, coming up now at the end of the month. And there's an extension if you need it. And, of course, these right-wing fascists, and any change, I would make more changes just to jerk them around, to get them, because somehow at a certain point, even the dumbest American will begin to see through this, right? Any change, they come on and whine and complain and yammer. So fine. So now there's an extension, right? Let's look at the quality of the propaganda on this. Let's see if we can find it. Okay, here we go. Neocon of the Washington Post, Michael Gerson, was a speechwriter for Bush. So he says, look, in my March 21st column on the potential impact of Obamacare during the next election, I wrote that health care premiums in Iowa were expected to rise by 100%. I was unaware that the source I relied on, which called the prediction recent, was actually describing a prediction that was a year old. Rates apparently are not now expected to rise nearly as much. Too bad if you died, huh? Too bad if that scared you off and you didn't get any health care. So I would urge people, look into it, right? Go on the site, see what kind of a subsidy you can get. If there's a subsidy available to you and you don't get it, you're a fool. And if you do that for the greater glory of the Austrian school, you can use that to comfort yourself when you're on your deathbed if you turn away from medical science and turn away from the possibilities of getting health care. So check it out. Maybe it's good for you. Maybe it's not. I suspect for a lot of people it's going to be, on the whole, quite a good deal. Now, there's a lot of lying, right? There's this question of this woman with leukemia, and the Koch brothers have a nationwide campaign, and it's all based on lies, right? This is a woman who's lying about her situation. She's obviously she's distraught. She's very sick, but unfortunately, other people don't need to die because of her venality. We're told that the Koch brothers are not simply interested in attacking the Affordable Care Act. They're trying to present the law as a case study in government ineptitude to change the way voters think about the role of government for years to come. This is inadmissible. The Koch brothers want a weak state. They want a failed state. These fascist brothers have to be defeated, and the way to do that is pursue your own enlightened self-interest. Take a look at the Obamacare website, and if you've got a good subsidy, grab it and get yourself some health insurance. Back next week on World Crisis Radio.